Hi folks, I'm Spencer, and on today's episode of Cult Mania we're going to be looking at another fairy tale reinventation, because they seem to be all the rage at the moment, with Shudders' new film, Hunted. Now, Hunted is a French-Belgium-Irish co-production directed by Vincent Paronnaud, who, to most people, is going to be best known as the co-director of the Oscar-nominated animated film Persepolis. But I mean, that is so far removed from the sort of film Hunted is. I mean, A, Hunted is live action. B, Hunted is not a biopic. It is a sort of gory stalking film. Now, I know what you're thinking. I said this was a fairy tale film, but I mean, the title of Hunted doesn't give away what it is. It's actually Little Red Riding Hood, except they've got rid of the granny living in the woods, and they've replaced the wolf with a pair of rapists. Also, I'm sorry, but Hunted is a really bad name for a film because it is so basic and obvious. Like, it doesn't make the film stand out at all. They'd have been better trying to play off something to do with Little Red Riding Hood, I think. The plot follows Lucy DeBay as Eve. She is a woman, she works for like a construction company building houses. She's pretty down on her luck. She's got a relationship that's not working out. So she decides to go and drown her sorrows at a local pub thing. I think it's a club, but it's really small. Anyway, she is there and she meets a guy who doesn't appear to be a creepo. Can you imagine what's going to happen next? Turns out he's a massive creepo who videos himself assaulting and murdering women. He and his accomplice bundle Eve into the trunk of their car to drive out to the woods to do horrible things, but then they crash the car, she gets out, and then it's basically a lot of running around in the woods as it's sort of that, who is the hunter and who is the hunted? Now, that as a plot isn't particularly anything new or interesting, but I would say that Hunted has like two key things that it tries to do differently. The one that's in all of the marketing is this sort of fairy tale strangeness to everything. You have the idea that in the opening we're told like a sort of fairy tale story that involves nature coming to the aid of a woman, and that plays out throughout the film. Every time sort of Eve is in peril, like a bird will swoop down and attack the two people that are chasing her. Which is a really cool concept, this idea of like nature as a protector, but it undoes a lot of, I think, what the film's going for, because it sort of takes Eve's agency away from her. She, you know, there are lots of points where you're like, she would definitely be dead if this animal hadn't come in and saved her, and it just, I don't know, it sort of undoes some of the sort of, yeah, she's defending herself sort of mood that you would want the film to have. I'd also just say that with the animal sort of coming in thing, it just perhaps doesn't do it, because it was like one of the things I'd read about, you know, as a key selling point for the film. It perhaps just doesn't do it as often as I think you want it to, which I'm gonna chalk up to like a budgetary thing, but it does sort of like, A, it becomes really obvious, and B, it just sort of, it's a little underwhelming in its it's a better idea than it is in practice. The film's better selling point is its main antagonist, the guy played by Ariel Wolfhalter. I don't know how to pronounce his name, so that's why it's come up on screen. Yeah! And he is only credited as the guy. I'm not just sort of being flippant. He's in the credits, the guy. He's really good. He's very hateable, and it's a very scenery-chewing performance. He is, like, overly a bit crazy, but I think that actually helps the film quite a bit, because I think it wants you to think that it's very sort of crazy and weird, because you have, you know, the fairy tale aspect to it, and the, you know, he really seems to get where the film needs to be pitched at. Like I said, it is very scenery chewing, and I think it could be grating if it weren't for the fact that I think he really is the standout part of the film. I really hated him, and I really wanted him to get got, which a film like this needs. This does come at the expense of, I think, the screenwriters and director clearly know that he's a very interesting character. It's a really good performance because you get a lot of time with him, to the point that he's on screen more in the film than probably anyone else, which does this weird thing of kind of becomes a bit more of the protagonist of the film. He's propelling the plot a lot more, and it just, again, it takes away from Eve and her character arc, because we spend more time getting to know and understand the person who we hate the most, which is, like I said, it's a weird thing, because it's both the strength of the film because his performance is so good, but it also just undoes the propelling point of the film. The cinematography is nothing really to write home about, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of the film takes place in the woods, you know, from probably, I'd say at least 2/3 of it is just in the woods. And they're very atmospheric woods, but, you know, you're not getting a huge amount of colour. It is very much, you know, greys, browns and greens, with sort of Eve's red jacket being the standout thing in all of that. The film opens with a very, very, very cool sort of silhouetted... I wasn't sure if it was animated or live action, or whether, you know, they did like a live action thing and then animated over the top of it, or what. Sort of storybook sequence. That's really cool. It's a shame because it's right at the start of the film and it's the most stylish part of the entire film. But overall, you know, it's very efficient. I think that's the, you know, you can tell that perhaps this didn't have the longest productions and they got everything done. And it works, you know, there's no point where I was like, oh, this is like dreary or dull to look at. It just doesn't do too much exciting. And when it does exciting things, like there's a bit where some fog descends, that looks cool. It's sort of, it's over and gone before you really have time to appreciate it. And there's like a weird bit that happens towards the end that I just didn't understand why they decided to use. There's like some strobing, and I was like, I don't get where this has come from. But overall, you know, it's not bad in any way.
Only a handful entered the forest. Giant wolves ran wild.
Much more underwhelming is the soundtrack for the film, which, I mean, it's very basic sort of synths, you know, wom, 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 wom. Sort of, you know, there's no composer credited. At least on IMDb, I didn't hang around in the credits because I didn't think to. It's very weird because I can't tell whether this is... That there's just a mistake there and there is a composer, or whether the soundtrack is like borrowed from elsewhere. In which case, I'd kind of go, if you were borrowing things from elsewhere, could you not pick some slightly more exciting stuff? It's serviceable, but a film like this really could do with like a really propulsive soundtrack to sort of get the blood pumping in some of the chasey bits, and it's just not there. That's probably the thing that disappointed me the most, was just the most, you know, really bland soundtrack.
Vincent's harsh and punishing emissary.
The film has a few sort of weird wow moments. I mean, I'd read people saying that the film was sort of really out there and crazy, and I think it has moments where that really comes through. I'm not going to spoil them because they are part of the joy of seeing the film, but they are a bit few and far between. They don't. It's not as weird as often as I would have liked it to be. It sort of feels a bit. I just think there's a sort of lack of. I think it must be a budget thing because, similarly, the film weirdly skimps out on its gore and its violence. There is like a death quite early on where we don't see it at all. We don't even really hear like any sound or scream, which is odd because if you were going that they weren't going to show us much violence on screen, you want the sound to make you imagine things, but then we don't get that. There's a bit where someone gets their throat cut, but their head is in the bottom of the frame, sort of there, so that the cutting is off screen, and it's just odd. I don't really. It must be a budget thing because, I mean, it's what you want to see in a film like this. You want the gore, and there are points where they go for it a bit more. And there were at least two moments that sort of made me go "Argh!" in a, ooh, that looks like it smarts a bit. It just doesn't commit to it as much as I wanted it to. That being said, I was quite glad that it doesn't go too heavy into the sort of horrible rapey men stuff. There's a bit where, like I said, the guy like films it on like a VHS camera. That's a cool little conceit because you get. Not only do you see like his old tapes, there are a couple of bits where he's recording, and it's a nice VHS look because you can actually see what's happening. Anyway, I digress. There is one bit where he sits and watches like an old video back, and it's very, very disturbing. But like the worst stuff either is left to your imagination or is shown very, very, very quickly in like he's fast forwarding through it, and you see just enough to know that you know what's happening, but it's not gratuitous. That being said, if people being really horrible to women is something that you find triggering, I'd either avoid Hunted, or it's quite obvious when you're going to get to the bit where he sits and watches something back. It's about 90 seconds, so perhaps just look away, fast forward. Because there's only that bit is the only bit that I would say is sort of alarming. Yeah.
The company of wolves is better than that of man.
This review I think has come across a bit more negative than I would like it to be, because Hunted overall, it's a fine film. It's just not. It's not an instant classic, and I don't think it's not something I'm particularly thinking of going back and watching again. I would say it wants to be something like. I think it wants to be Revenge from a few years ago, but it's not got the style or the gore or the soundtrack or it's not as clever as that film, but you can sort of see that that's where it's coming from with its structure and the way it wants to sort of reinvent this style of film. It's just nowhere near as good. That's the problem. And I think in part there is clearly some. I don't know whether it's a budget. It must be a budget thing that it's just not quite getting there. And like I said, I'd read people saying that it was really weird and out there, and I didn't see any of that on screen. It has a lot of good ideas, but it sort of It does them by half. It doesn't fully commit to any of them, and I just don't think it works quite how you want it to. I don't know, perhaps because it was French, I thought it was going to be a bit more like New French Extremity, like, you know, it was going to be harder hitting. It left me a little bit like cold. I mean, you know, all this being said, if you are interested in your sort of people hunted in the wilderness with the sort of vaguely rape revenge aspect to it, there are far worse films to watch. It will pass 90 minutes, and if you've got Shudder already, you're not losing anything if you give it a go. And I think it seems to be dividing people, because there are people that seem to really love it, and then there seem to be people that really hate it, and I'm just sort of stuck in the middle of like, it's fine. But yeah, like I said, if you've got nothing better to do, it'll pass the time, and there's that really solid performance. There's some neat ideas that I think people may pick up and run with in later films. It's just not one I'm thinking I'll ever go back to. But that is just my opinion. Have you got round to Hunted? Does it sound like your sort of thing? Let me know down in the comments. Like and subscribe so you don't miss some more videos. And I shall see you next time.